From the Mists. Presented by DeCA. Story written by APXL. Chapter 1. The Blue Mists. Golden sunlight painted the skies on that crisp, early summer morning. Cool breezes hung in the air, the winds gently caressing the trees as the heavy scent of the pines wafted throughout the forest. Birds sang a merry tune from above, while below, squirrels scurried about in search of a meal. A calm silence befell the air, one which can only be found throughout the likes of Mother Nature itself. Meanwhile, gentle waves lapped up against the shore of one of the many thousand lakes which bore into the geography of Minnesota. And at the edge of one of these lakes, there was a small beach, where upon it lied a girl aged no more than 15. Young Annabelle Sommers was her name, and upon this very shore, she was enjoying one of her favorite pastimes, becoming one with the serenity of nature. She could feel the sting of the sun caressing her skin. With a deep, elongated breath, she listened intently while the birds continued to sing, and she felt the peace here unlike that which she had experienced anywhere else. This was her happy place, the place where she knew she was the safest and the most in tune with not only nature, but with herself. But of course, it wasn't to last long, for moments after she had finally shut her eyes, ready to take a brief, cozy nap in the sand, she was brought to her senses by the sound of footsteps. Immediately, she sat upright, sand falling from her bushy brown hair. Who could have disturbed her, she wondered. Turning her head, she was annoyed, but not at all surprised, to find her twin sister approaching her. Isabelle.
Thought I'd find you here.
Isabelle said, her voice laden with the familiar condescending tone which Annabelle had grown used to hearing from her over the years.
It's time to head back. Mom says breakfast is nearly ready.
But what if I'm not ready to head back yet?
Annabelle then retorted. She had the sneaking suspicion that her sister had only approached her now because she knew it would annoy her the most. Isabelle knew exactly where her sister would be, after all, as the two girls had become more than familiar with this particular beach over the years.
How do I know you're not lying like you always do?
That's for you to decide, sis.
She then replied.
Just know that Grandma is the one doing the cooking today. And she's making her homemade biscuits. You wouldn't want to miss that now, would you?
Annabelle's stomach gave a growl. The idea of missing out on her grandmother's cooking was not one she was fond of. Despite this, she knew deep down that there was no way that breakfast could be ready yet. She'd barely been outside for 20 minutes. Unless…
Isabelle, what time is it exactly?
She then asked, trying to see if her suspicions were true or not.
9:45.
She replied, without missing a beat. But Annabelle wasn't fooled. Isabelle wasn't wearing her watch, nor did she have any device on her to check the time in the moment. Trivial as this all may seem, this wasn't out of the ordinary for the two girls, as Isabelle had a bad habit of trying to rob Annabelle of her alone time wherever possible, even if just to annoy her. It was a mean quirk of hers, and she knew well that Annabelle was very fond of this time, as she wasn't a very social or interactive person. Unlike Isabelle herself, Annabelle preferred to keep to her solitude, hence why her favorite pastime was just simply to be alone. Isabelle was the exact opposite, as she much preferred being surrounded by her clique of friends, those of which who often teased Annabelle for not being very outgoing. Many times, Annabelle had begged her sister to back off or lighten up, but she rarely did, much to her misfortune.
Look, I'm not stupid, sis.
Annabelle then said.
It was just past 7 when I left the house.
Sounds to me like you spaced out again, just like you always do.
Isabelle then responded.
Because yep, it's 9:45.
Annabelle groaned. She knew this wasn't true, and she also knew that breakfast couldn't possibly be ready yet. Childish though it was, clearly this was just another case of Isabelle trying to play a trick on her. Though despite this, Annabelle felt very strange about the situation for some reason. Did she actually space out this time? And 2 hours had indeed passed her by. It wouldn't be the first time this had happened, of course. Yet it wasn't beneath Isabelle to tell a lie like this. She knew her sister quite intentionally opted to not bring any electronics with her on her little excursions, as she found being by herself very therapeutic. So really there was no way of knowing what time it actually was. Annabelle heaved a sigh, knowing full well she had been played yet again.
All right, I'll come back.
she finally said.
I really don't believe you, though.
Oh, come on, sis, would I ever? Wait, what is that?
The sudden shift in Isabel's tone caught Annabelle off guard, and she turned to face the direction to which her sister was looking. It didn't take long to find what had caught her attention, for not far ahead of the two of them arose a strange plume of some kind of blue vapor. It was unlike anything either of them had seen before. It was thick and puffy, though solid enough that it rose out in one continuous stream. Immediately, Annabelle felt very strange looking at it, and judging by the look on her sister's face, she knew that Isabelle must have too.
What on earth could that be?
Annabelle responded in question, her voice rising up an octave, as it did in times when she was intrigued by something. Suddenly, the little rouse about time and breakfast wasn't important anymore, as both girls were transfixed at the scene. It was difficult to tell where the vapor was coming from, though Annabelle guessed that it was close, and coming from somewhere near the lake bed.
Let's go have a look, shall we?
Isabelle then suggested, though this idea didn't settle well with Annabelle. She looked at her sister as if she had asked her to a party or something, the kind of look that told her she must be insane to suggest such a thing.
Maybe we should just head back to the cabin.
Annabelle then said, though her sister wasn't having it.
But this could be the discovery of a lifetime.
Isabelle said.
And since when did you care about discoveries?
Annabelle then asked, though upon hearing this she couldn't help but feel a little intrigue. Perhaps this was Isabelle's intent, as she knew well that Annabelle was very much into the idea of discovering something new for herself.
Hey, I think anyone would be curious if they suddenly saw something like that.
She responded, and she wasn't wrong. The sight was so abnormal, it would be hard to look away.
But it could be dangerous.
Annabelle stated.
If it truly were dangerous, I think this entire area would be under quarantine.
Isabelle replied.
The smoke rises pretty high. There is no way anyone wouldn't have caught notice of it. Come on, sis. Where's that spirit of adventure that you used to have? Or was that lost too when you became such a boring recluse?
Annabelle grumbled something unintelligible. A nerve had been struck with that one. Sure, there was no denying she was a recluse, but she considered herself anything but boring.
Fine.
She finally said.
But if we go back to the cabin with extra limbs, don't come crying to me.
That's the spirit.
Isabelle then replied giddily. The two girls then set off toward the strange column of blue mysteries, Annabelle questioning the decision with each step they took in its direction. The journey was thankfully short, as its source in fact wasn't at all far from where they had been. As predicted, it was in fact coming from the edge of the lake, and they arrived to find that the strange mysterious vapor was seeping through cracks in the dirt itself.
Whoa!
They said in unison upon arriving on site.
What is that?
Isabelle asked, as if Annabelle would know. She merely shook her head.
I'm not sure I like this.
She then replied.
This could be one of those toxic waste dump zones or something. For all we know, it could be radioactive.
Really? Here?
Isabelle asked.
I thought this entire area was protected under law as a reserve. Someone would have to be doing some serious law breaking if they're using the lakes as dump sites.
People have been known to do worse.
Annabelle replied, wishing in the moment that she actually brought her phone with her so that she could record the strange phenomenon. But, moments after she said this, something quite bizarre happened, for the cracks in the ground began to widen as if on their own accord, and more of the strange blue mist spilled out and upward toward the skies. The two girls stood only a few feet away from the phenomena, but that distance shrank slightly at the increase in the gaps.
This really isn't safe.
Annabelle then said.
We need to get out of here and call someone.
Call who?
Isabelle asked.
The cops? What would they do?
I don't know, but let's be honest for a minute here. What can we do exactly? I'm getting a really uneasy feeling the longer we linger around this place.
Well, isn't that strange? Because I feel kinda, relaxed.
Isabelle then replied, causing Annabelle to turn her head toward her sister in surprise. But, where she had expected to see a smirk or grin giving away the obvious joke, she did not. Instead, she saw a serene expression upon her face, an expression that she knew her sister did not wear often. It appeared to be a mixture of bliss and just pure glee.
Relaxed. You can't be serious.
Annabelle replied, Though quite suddenly, a strange sensation engulfed her body too. It was as if all of her senses had shut off at once, and she felt a wave of euphoria spread throughout her body. Her muscles relaxed, and a distinctive calmness overtook her, overriding any other feelings or emotions she had felt before this.
Yeah,
Isabelle replied.
I could stay here forever.
You know, I think I could too.
Annabelle then said, finally in agreement with her sister. But a loud crash suddenly brought both girls to their senses, for some of the earth beneath the vapor had given way again as the gaps continued to widen. Only a foot of ground remained now between the two of them and the ever-widening hole that was forming right in front of their eyes. Cracks continued to spread across the dirt, and more blue vapors began to seep out of the new openings. The girls then turned to one another, panicked. It took no communication between them to determine what they'd do next, as they each turned around quickly and proceeded to embark on a hasty retreat back in the direction they had come from. Panting and out of breath, they finally slowed their pace once they had made it back safely upon the familiar lakeside beach. Annabelle collapsed into the sand, feeling extremely tired all of a sudden. Every muscle in her body was screaming in agony, as if she had just endured an extensive workout routine, even though she hadn't actually run very far. Isabelle followed suit, falling upon her backside. It was clear that the odd mists had affected her just as heavily.
Annabelle,
She then said in an exhausted voice.
look!
With some effort, Annabelle turned to face the direction which Isabelle was indicating, only to find a rather curious sight. The mists had thickened into a heavy column by this point, their hues a deep shade of sapphire. But it wasn't the mists that Isabelle was focused on, but rather the point where the mists had met the skies. The vapors branched out in every which direction, meshing into a set of newly formed dark clouds. Steadily, rapidly, the mass of clouds was growing, filling the skies above at an alarming rate. Before long, all of the overhead in the foreseeable distance had its skies replaced with these newly formed threats.
Oh no,
Annabelle stated.
this is not normal. This is really, really not normal.
We need to get back to the cabin.
Isabelle said, using her remaining energy to push herself to her feet.
I have a feeling that these clouds are going to come with a major storm.
We're going to have to tell someone about what we saw too, you know.
Annabelle then stated, trying her best to stand as well, though her legs were not having it. Isabelle responded by lending out a helping hand, steadying her sister to her feet.
Would anyone actually believe us, though?
Isabelle then questioned.
Probably not unless they saw for themselves what was happening.
Annabelle replied.
There is no way in hell that we're the only ones who witnessed this.
You better be right on that, sis, because it'll be even more terrifying if we were.
With an immense amount of effort, Annabelle and Isabelle began the arduous half-mile walk back to the cabin, all while the clouds continued to thicken above their heads. Normally, this walk was a peaceful and relaxing trek, as it was a symbol of familiarity, the link between two places that were special and nostalgic. That day, however, they may as well have been climbing a mountain, as each step was laborious and difficult, and this was the case even before the rain started, as it did swiftly, skipping the stages of the light trickles and drizzles, instead erupting in a massive soaking downpour. To add insult to injury, the outside temperature took a sudden downward spiral. What had started as a warm, pleasant summer morning was now a bone-chilling, teeth-chattering, soggy day. If you were to ask either of the twin girls just how they had managed to get back to the cabin without collapsing, it is likely that neither would be able to provide a coherent response. Yet by some miracle, they made it, greeted by the worried yelps of their mother and grandmother as they appeared into view of the backsliding door.
Oh, thank heavens!
Their grandmother exclaimed.
We were worried sick about you two.
Where on earth did all this rain come from?
Their mother then asked. But neither of the girls responded as they pulled themselves up the short set of stairs toward the cabin.
Hannah, get them some towels. They are soaked to the bone.
Their grandmother commanded, though her words were of concern and love.
As for you two, get inside. You'll catch hypothermia if you stay out there any longer than you already have.
The sound of the sliding door closing behind them was a very welcome sound, as it meant that their journey had come to an end. Immediate warmth met the two girls as they both fell to the floor, their bodies unable to carry on any longer without some rest. Shortly after, their mother emerged holding 2 thick towels, those of which were accepted graciously.
I just don't understand.
Their mother, Hannah, stated.
I've never seen a storm emerge so quickly before. One moment it was clear and sunny, the next. Well, this.
Huh, if you think that's crazy,
Their grandmother then started.
you haven't seen crazy. It was the month of June, 1987. We were sitting at the lakeside when…
Look, this really isn't the time.
Hannah then interjected.
Let's at least make sure the girls are okay first before you launch into one of your crazy tales.
Fine, fine.
The grandmother replied, turning her back away from the trio. Judging by the sound of sizzling from the stove and the distinctive scent of bacon, it was clear that she was still making breakfast. It was Annabelle who spoke next, finally catching her breath enough to talk.
Did you see it?
She then asked, looking at her mother very seriously.
Did I see what?
She replied in question.
The mist.
Annabelle explained,
There's no way you could have not seen it.
but her mother only gave her a confused look.
All I saw was that freak storm appear. But it doesn't matter now. You're safe and dry, and you're not going to go out there again.
Food will be ready very soon.
Their grandmother then said.
Hopefully a hot meal will get the 2 of you on your feet again.
It was then that Annabelle remembered the reason her sister had gone to find her to begin with. Breakfast. It had all started with breakfast, and the obvious lie that it had been nearly ready at the time. Curiosity then caused Annabelle to glance upward at the grandfather clock that stood proudly in the living room. As she had expected, the small hand had barely surpassed 8. But this didn't matter now. What mattered was getting out of her soaked clothes and changing into something more comfortable. 20 minutes later, both girls were sitting warmly on the sofa, now showered and dressed in dry, clean clothes. While still quite exhausted, they were at very least able to function and speak again.
Do we tell them about what we saw?
Isabelle then asked, causing Annabelle to look at her in alarm. It wasn't very often that Isabelle looked at her for confirmation for anything, after all, as she was often the one who led the charge when it came to making decisions.
Later.
Annabelle replied.
We can tell them later. Maybe once this storm passes, we can show them.
That's if the storm passes.
Her sister then stated glumly.
Plus, there is no telling the mist will linger around long enough for them to see it.
Fair point.
Annabelle said.
We'll just have to see what happens, I guess.
Girls, there is something that you might want to come see.
The voice of their apparently confused mother then said from the kitchen. Both girls reacted at once, perhaps thinking the same thing too. Had her mother seen the blue mist? As it turned out, however, that wasn't the case at all. For a much different sight than expected awaited them when they arrived at the back door. No longer was it pouring rain, but instead, thick, fluffy white puffs were falling furiously from above.
Snow?
Annabelle then asked, realizing immediately why her mother had been so confused.
But how? It's June?
Of course, being that the Sommer family lived in Minnesota, they were no strangers to snow. But it was quite rare to see so much as a flurry after April. Additionally, Annabelle had seen the forecast for the week just that morning, so she was certain that it wouldn't get below 60 for the whole of the foreseeable future.
This day is just full of surprises.
Isabelle then said.
Believe me, I'm just as confused and amazed as you are.
Their mother then said with a chuckle.
This was definitely not how I expected our vacation to start. Let's see what the news has to say about it all.
Good idea.
Annabelle chimed in.
Breakfast is ready.
The older voice of their grandmother then said. Annabelle couldn't help but laugh to herself at this. This was so typical of their grandmother, to become so transfixed in her cooking that she completely ignored everything else happening around her.
Grandma, you should look outside.
Annabelle suggested, directing her attention to the window. But apparently, the sight of the very late season snowfall didn't affect her much, as she just smirked and turned back to the food so that she could prepare plates.
I think it's going to take much more than a bit of snow to surprise her.
Their mother then winked.
Yeah, we should know better by now.
Annabelle laughed.
I guess, unless it can somehow surpass whatever happened that day in June of '87.
Oh, please. Do you really have to bring that up again?
Isabelle asked in a mocking tone.
We've heard the story 1,000 times at this point, and still we have no idea what it means. It was June 1987. We were sitting by the lake, looking out at the sky.
And then suddenly, out of nowhere, there it was.
Annabelle continued the story, her voice suddenly very dramatic.
Like an angel falling from the heavens. It was upon us, growing ever larger as time ticked away into oblivion.
Never, in all my life, had I faced death head-on like I did that day.
Their grandmother then took over, apparently taking great delight in retelling this tale.
Like a ball of burning ash, it confronted me until I was soon face to face with the beast. But, dear child, if you think I was brave and that I was able to face my fears, you would be sadly mistaken, for I did what anyone would do. I turned tail and headed straight back home.
But no sooner had you arrived, did you hear it?
Annabelle proceeded, recalling the words verbatim.
It was hard not to hear after all, for it must have been the only noise within 1,000 miles. Splash, splash, splash.
It echoed through my very soul.
Her grandmother took over again.
And I had never been more terrified in my entire life.
Annabelle concluded. Both her mother and Isabelle clapped as she finished, and even the grandmother looked impressed.
Perhaps I have told this story a few too many times.
She said,
But that aside, we have a breakfast to enjoy. I'm sure you two are starved.
Please and thank you.
Annabelle replied. She was in far better spirits now that she was back in good company and away from the accursed storm. Over the course of the following hour, the four women sat in the dining room, eating their meals and watching the news in case anyone took notice of the strange winter storm. At first, Annabelle had started to doubt whether or not the odd phenomenon had reached the media, for the news blips at the bottom of the screen still displayed the day to be warm and sunny. However, before long, an emergency alert appeared, followed shortly by one of the news anchors themselves announcing they had a developing breaking news scenario playing out in Minnesota. Heart pounding in her chest, Annabelle's attention was immediately glued to the screen. She wondered if they were going to report on the blue mist, too.
It has come to our attention that a strange weather emergency has befallen a few of the states in the Midwest, most notably Minnesota.
She started.
It appears that a winter storm has cropped up, seemingly out of the blue. Let's turn the story over to our meteorologists for the details.
Thank you, Bree.
The weatherman then said as the cameras turned their attention to him.
And good morning, America. This is Nate Brown, reporting on a developing storm that is baffling scientists across both the nation and the world. Within the heart of Minnesota, only a couple hundred miles north of the Minneapolis area, a mass of clouds has appeared that are capable of producing an unseasonably quantity of snow. Remember, folks, we're in June now, and we had predicted the April 27th winter event to be the final storm of the season for this area. And to make matters even more confusing is the fact that this very morning the forecast looked not unlike what you see on the screen here.
A 7-day forecast appeared on the screen just then, detailing the original forecast of warm, sunny, and completely snow-free days.
I think it's safe to say that some adjustments have been made, although these adjustments are going to paint a rather confusing picture.
The weatherman then changed the slide, revealing the new forecast, though what appeared on the screen was quite concerning. Below the weather graphic, which would normally display the temperature prediction, there was instead a series of large question marks. Above the marks, no graphic existed at all, instead revealing an empty space within the circle which would normally contain a cloud or little sun, displaying what the weather should be like for the day.
Now, this is not something we meteorologists like to admit to often, as it's our job to ensure a reasonable prediction of the days ahead. But as it stands today, we have to admit to the truth. We do not know where this storm has come from, as it's completely out of the normal scope of possibility for the weather at this time of the year. We also do not know what it's capable of, or if it will remain localized within this region, or if it will continue to spread. Outside this bubble of clouds, you will see that the weather continues to remain on par with what can be expected during this time of the year, but we are keeping a close eye on this mysterious storm to determine whether or not that will need some adjustments too. Preliminary suggestions point toward climate change and the ever-changing patterns that have been seen all across the globe. But nothing is said for certain yet, only that this storm really is something for the history books, as never had I seen anything to this scale before. We will continue to provide updates as the situation continues to unfold. And to those few who have been caught underneath the umbrella of this storm, I hope for your sake that you are in a position where you have some wintertime implements at hand. And now, back to you, Bree.
Climate change. What a bunch of malarkey.
Their grandmother then said with frustration.
They'll use that as an excuse for anything nowadays. And to not even be able to predict what the storm can do. I swear, the further we advance with technology, the more out of touch people become with reality.
Well, do you have any suggestions for what caused it?
Annabelle asked.
It's just the natural course of nature, dear.
She replied confidently.
And if they truly are going to make a national announcement over a little snow in Minnesota, then they really need to change their priorities. For God's sakes, it's Minnesota. People give it the nickname Minnesota for a reason.
I don't know, Grandma.
Annabelle then said.
Because if you saw what my sister and I saw this morning, you might have some other thoughts.
3 heads turned toward Annabelle at this point as silence befell the room. Hannah looked both concerned and curious. Grandma appeared interested, and Isabelle just looked a little surprised that she had decided to choose this moment to bring this up. For a moment, the 2 sisters' eyes locked, as if Annabelle was looking to her sister for confirmation that now was the time to talk about it. She nodded her approval.
All right.
She started, having the full undivided attention of the 2 adults.
I'm going to ask that you keep an open mind for a minute here, because I know how crazy this is going to sound. But it all started when Isabelle found me on the beach earlier.
And so, for 20 minutes, Annabelle explained what had happened, starting from the massive plume of blue mist. She explained in elaborate detail about how she and Isabelle felt an unnatural feeling of calm while in its presence, and how they had decided to see firsthand what it was. Isabelle chimed in on several occasions, telling about her side of things too, and the 2 adults just sat and listened while the story continued. When they finished, it took several moments for either of them to speak again.
It would seem that you two have inherited your grandmother's knack for storytelling.
Hannah then said.
This is on par with the June of '87 story, if nothing else.
Mom.
Annabelle protested.
We're not joking.
Isabelle then stated with frustration, but their grandmother had a different take on the tale, as she had remained silent throughout the entire explanation.
You know, Justin used to say things like this too all the time.
She said. A sudden pang shot through Annabelle at these words.
Justin?
She said, her voice trailing off.
That's right.
She replied.
He said he would dream about strange blue smoke coming up from the ground, much like what you claim to have seen. Of course, he wouldn't claim it was a dream, but...
Grandma, please.
Annabelle then pleaded.
Can we not talk about Justin?
Her voice was shaking. The thought of Justin made her choke up, as old memories began to resurface once more, memories that she wished deeply she could suppress.
It's okay to talk about him, you know?
Their mother then said.
There is nothing at all wrong with reminiscing about the past. Believe me, I miss him too.
I know.
Annabelle then replied, tears starting to form in her eyes.
It's just... hard.
Immediately, thoughts of a young, pale boy entered her mind. This boy once was so full of life and energy, the infectious sort which would make even the most grumpy person smile. That was, until the cancer struck, one that was so potent and severe that it sapped every ounce of energy he once had straight out of him. Even the doctors couldn't determine what kind of cancer it was, for they had never seen it before. It was new and different. And needless to say, he did not last much longer after the diagnosis. Isabelle, too, appeared uncomfortable at the mention of his name, and who could blame her? The 2 girls had lost their one and only brother far too soon. In fact, this was only the 3rd summer they'd be spending without him. Annabelle wondered what he'd be thinking at the sight of the sudden snowfall, as she knew just how much he loved it. He'd probably be over the moon at the sight of it. It was a struggle for Annabelle to contain herself, but she continued to fight, remembering her promise that she'd stay strong for her brother's sake. Despite this, it was clear that both her mother and grandmother could tell how much she had been affected by this.
I'm sorry, dear.
Their grandmother then said,
I really shouldn't have brought that up.
It's all right.
Annabelle responded, her voice still shaky.
And you're right. It's okay to talk about him. It's just...
I wish I could say it gets easier.
Their mother then chimed in with a chuckle, but it was clear that the thought of him had affected her too.
It's the same as with your father, too.
As if a switch was flipped, the atmosphere in the room suddenly changed. It was their grandmother who had caused the tension this time, however, as the soft features upon her face suddenly hardened.
Don't tell me you still defend that man after what he had done.
She then said sternly.
I can never forgive him.
Their mother replied.
He made his choice. But that doesn't mean we cannot remember the good times we had with him.
But we cannot ever forget what he put you through either.
She replied. Now, if one were to look in at this conversation from the outside, they'd simply see a senile old woman talking bad about her daughter's lost love interest, and such a thing would be common, if even expected. In this case, however, it was different, as the father in question was actually her very own son, Adam Sommers. His name was the father of Isabelle, Annabelle, and Justin, the same Justin whose funeral he failed to attend, and the very same family he had left behind so that he could move to Illinois to be with another woman. Needless to say, this departure left a scar upon the family which he so desperately wanted to leave behind. His actions had been so vile, in fact, that even his own parents had turned against him.
I think this our cue to leave the room.
Annabelle then said, having a very strong inkling that this conversation was about to turn nasty. Isabelle nodded in agreement. And so, the semi-annual argument began between their mother and grandmother about Adam. While there were a lot of things that Annabelle and Isabelle disagreed on, their stance on their father wasn't one of those things. In fact, they vastly sided with their grandmother about him. Even though her words about him were perhaps too overtly harsh, they couldn't even refer to the man as their father anymore, much to their mother's frustration, instead calling him by his actual name, Adam.
How could you still have any feelings for him after what he did?
They heard their grandmother say.
Hannah, look, you need to move past this. All of us do. He built his coffin, and now he's lying in it.
I know, but he's still your son.
She said.
And he's still the father of your grandchildren. Surely that has some value.
I'm sorry, but his monthly $400 child support payments aren't nearly enough to win me over.
She responded.
He's a shameful man, and I'm ashamed to call myself his mother.
Looks like we'll be spending the day in our rooms.
Annabelle then sighed.
And so much for our talk about the blue mist. Not that I think either of them believed us anyhow.
Yep, you can say that again.
Isabelle responded.
We'll just have to try and bring it up again when things have settled down.
What makes you on board with this idea of telling them all of a sudden?
Annabelle then asked, remembering how hesitant that Isabelle was to the thought.
Well, because even if I still think it's crazy, it's also the truth.
Isabelle said.
And it seems to be affecting more than just the four of us. Did you notice that not a single line on the news was said about the mist?
The thought did in fact cross my mind.
Annabelle replied.
But how are we supposed to tell anyone about it? Nobody is going to believe two teenagers, especially with a tall tale as outlandish as this.
I say we make this tomorrow's problem, okay?
She then suggested.
We really should take some time to think about everything we saw and process it. Plus, we really have to keep a close eye on the weather itself and see if this storm blows over or not.
Annabelle looked defeated.
But if we wait,
the storm has attracted the attention of the entire nation.
Isabelle then stated.
It's not like the problem will just be forgotten.
I suppose you're right.
Annabelle replied with a sigh.
This will give us time to think of a more tactful approach to this anyhow. If we tell the cops the way we told Mom and Grandma, they'll probably just laugh in our faces.
Again, tomorrow's problems.
Isabelle yawned.
I'm going to lie down for now. Listening to what's going on in the kitchen makes me realize that we now have two storms to wait out instead of just one. I want nothing to do with that conversation.
Nor do I.
Annabelle replied in agreement. Snow continued to fall as the day wore on, seemingly without end. It remained steady and strong, spitting out heavy quantities of thick, puffy flakes. But there was one new development which Annabelle did not at all like. Thunder. Snow or not, she did not at all like storms. In fact, she was terrified of them. This was a trait she had at a very young age, and unfortunately for her, it's not one she grew out of as she got older. In fact, the dissonance towards storms only seemed to grow with age, and every rumble of thunder got to her to the point that she was cowering in her bed by the third hour of it. She wanted desperately for this storm to just be over. Thankfully, the arguing from the kitchen had ceased after 20 minutes or so, but that only left her alone with the storms. This, in combination with her roaring thoughts about the recent events, caused Annabelle to become anxious and unnerved, so much so that she no longer wished to be alone. But perhaps she didn't have to be, she thought. Her mother and grandma would likely still be awake, as it was only mid-afternoon, despite it being dark enough outside to be late evening. The thought of this comforted Annabelle to the point that she got out of bed and made her way into the living room. Much to her surprise, her mother was sitting upon the sofa across from the fireplace reading a book, where presently a warm and cozy fire was roaring in its heart. The windows positioned on either side of the fireplace illuminated the perfect winter scene, if only it were actually winter. Nevertheless, the picturesque scene reminded Annabelle of the many holidays that she would spend here at the cabin with her family, and she felt a sense of comfort and warmth, much unlike just moments earlier in her bedroom. She then took a deep breath to ease her nerves. Her mother appeared to have a nose in a book as Annabelle approached, and it took a few moments for her to notice that her daughter had just arrived. Once she did, however, she smiled in her direction.
Some storm this is.
She said, as a low rumble of thunder echoed somewhere above them.
I can't say I've seen anything like it.
Yeah.
Annabelle replied, though she still felt a little unnerved. Her mind was still racing with thoughts from earlier that day, and knowing that the mist had caused the storm made all the difference, as she knew not what this storm was capable of. Her mom must have picked up on the hints in the tone of her voice, as she gave Annabelle a pitying look. She then placed her book onto her lap and motioned for Annabelle to sit down.
What's on your mind, Annie?
She asked, using the pet name which was often reserved for times such as this, when Annabelle had hit a low point.
You seem bothered by something.
It's just the thunder.
She responded, though this was of course only a half-truth.
You know how it makes me feel.
I figured that was the case.
She responded.
But hey, storms don't last forever, right? I'd be willing to bet that tomorrow all the snow will melt and it will be a gorgeous sunny day.
That is not what the weatherman said.
Annabelle then said glumly. Her mother fell into silence for a few minutes after, clearly trying to think of a response that wouldn't sound so uncertain. Annabelle, who knew her mother well, picked up on this immediately, and she did not feel reassured.
How cold do you think it is out there?
She then asked, trying to change the subject slightly.
I'm not sure, but it's much colder than it should be.
Her mother replied.
Thankfully, there was still some leftover firewood from last winter, so I put it to good use. Your grandmother decided to go rest, though. I think the cold was starting to get to her.
I can see that. It is pretty chilly in here.
Annabelle said with a chuckle, just as she let out a shiver of her own. She then took hold of the spare blanket that was lying on the couch next to her mom and covered herself up with it.
Speaking of Grandma, how is she? Is everything all right between you two?
Yeah, everything is all right. You know how she gets when the topic of your father is brought up.
She responded.
But hey, that's neither here nor there. You know what I always say, we shouldn't worry so much about the past, and instead,
Just focus on the future, I know.
Annabelle finished, knowing full well what was coming.
Speaking of the future, we should probably talk about what will happen tomorrow, in case this storm decides to stick around a little longer than expected.
She then stated.
What? So you don't think it'll be a sunny day after all then?
Annabelle asked, though she suspected this from the start. Her mother laughed in response.
I suppose I'll come clean.
She stated.
The fact that they're so uncertain about all this makes me just as uncertain. I have a feeling the storm may be sticking around a while.
Great.
Annabelle said sarcastically.
But hey, we could be wrong about it all.
She then said optimistically.
It could disappear overnight, and we could in fact have that sunny day tomorrow that we wish for. But we need to be prepared, and I don't know about you, but I don't think this is a good place to get stuck if it does decide to linger. So, after some chatting with your grandma, we're going to plan to head back home in the morning if there are no signs of relief.
Back to Pine Falls?
Annabelle then asked.
Is it any better there than here?
Surprisingly, it is.
She responded.
As it turns out, it's still warm and sunny there, just as it should be for June, at least for the moment. There is talk that the storm could spread southward, but I'd rather be trapped at home where there's a grocery store right around the corner than trapped here where the closest civilization is 30 miles away.
I suppose that's a fair point.
Annabelle responded.
Let's hope they brought some guys out to plow the roads, though. Or at very least that Grandpa kept some extra snow tires in the shed.
He was quite resourceful.
Her mother replied.
If he did, though, they're probably rotted through by now. Either way, staying here isn't in anyone's best interest if this continues. Our SUV can handle the roads. It's been through worse.
Annabelle laughed, as she knew very well that this was true. Living in the state of Minnesota, dealing with snow was second nature to the Sommer family, so she didn't in the slightest doubt her mother's claim. Still, it was already several inches thick out there at quick glance, and Annabelle hoped that at very least some of it would either melt away, or the snow would slow down overnight to make the situation a little more bearable. Another roar of thunder signaled that the storm was still far from over, though. Annabelle let out a shudder yet again, but then sighed. This had been going on long enough at this point that she was starting to get more annoyed than anything. Strange though it may seem, Annabelle was actually starting to long for that moment of peace she had felt earlier that day in the presence of the mysterious mist. But as the thought of it arrived once more to the forefront of her mind, she quickly considered bringing it up with her mother again. Earlier, it didn't seem as if she were invested in hers and Isabelle's story. However, perhaps she would be able to convince her of the truth now.
Look, about earlier.
She started, focusing her mind on the mysterious blue vapor and the events that happened a few hours prior. But the thought never went anywhere, as all of a sudden there was a reverberating thud that resonated from the direction of the bedrooms. Both Annabelle and her mother jumped, equally as startled at the incoming noise.
What was that?
Annabelle's mother then asked, leaping to her feet with haste.
It sounded like it came from your grandmother's room.
It did, didn't it?
Annabelle replied, feeling suddenly very nervous. Clearly, the object that had fallen was very heavy, leaving her to fear that her grandmother had fallen from her bed. Though she hadn't spent much time in that bedroom, Annabelle recalled the bed to consist of one of those higher-set mattresses, so falling from such a height would most certainly cause an injury.
I'll go check on her.
Her mother then announced, striding over in the direction of her room. Annabelle herself merely nodded in response, listening intently to hear if her grandmother was trying to call out for help or not. Initial signs were pointing positive at least, as she heard no such noises, though her calls may have been muffled and covered up by the sounds of rumbling thunder. Once again left to herself, Annabelle let out an exasperated sigh. It would seem the fates would not allow her to speak of the mist to her mother for a second time, though thinking more into it, she started to doubt that she'd be able to convince her anyhow. Her mother wasn't exactly the type who believed in fairy tales. Even growing up, she had mentioned that she didn't have an affinity for childish things such as that. Perhaps she wasn't the best person to confide in regarding the events. But if she couldn't speak to her own mother about it, who could she talk to? A stiff chill overcame Annabelle as she thought. Even covered by the blanket, she was realizing just how cold in the house it had become, and the dying fire did her no favors. She then recalled how her mother had mentioned there was firewood left over from the previous winter. Knowing that her grandfather used to store it in the shed, she thought that it may be a good idea for her to try and retrieve some. It would be a welcome surprise for her mother, after all, to return to find the fire once again glowing and alive, keeping the place warm and toasty. Standing to her feet, Annabelle retreated to the back door, trying to ignore the rumbling thunder from overhead. Thankfully, the thunder seemed to finally be dissipating now, as its echoes seemed farther away. But a quick glimpse into the storm revealed that the snow was still a ways off of fully running its course. Beside the door, a set of boots stood, likely brought there by her mother when she had made her own trip outside. Annabelle slipped them on her own feet, then opened the door. A blast of Arctic air hit her immediately, and chills engulfed the entirety of her body. Annabelle stood for a second, contemplating whether or not she should even go out there, but she reasoned that it was only a bit of snow. As a Minnesotan, it would be a disgrace to be turned away by such a thing, so she steeled herself at last and took a step outside. There was no telling how cold it was, but it must have been extremely so, as immediately a numbness hit her like a truck. Figuring it wouldn't last but a few minutes at most, Annabelle decided to keep going anyhow, approaching the shed with caution. Beneath her, she found that she had seriously misjudged the depth of the snow, as her boots had sank in fully, and the snow itself rose up toward her knees. After a couple of minutes, full of shivering and self-doubts, she arrived, thankfully to find the shed was already ajar. She quickly opened it, grateful to find that firewood was still stacked neatly inside it, and she immediately gathered a few pieces beneath her arms. Upon exiting the shed, however, something caught her attention from just beyond the back gate. Annabelle, who was suddenly quite distracted, immediately dropped the firewood, as whatever she had just seen caused her to recoil in surprise.
What in the?
She then said aloud, Now, it's important to note here that Annabelle was the type of girl who would drink in the entirety of her surroundings, and could easily point out any oddities had they occurred, especially if it were in a place that she was familiar with. After 15 years of coming to this cabin, it's safe to say that she was extremely familiar with this area, especially given that the fact that path leading behind the shed was also the same path that led to the beach. A set of trees marked the edge of this path, pine trees that were around 8 to 10 feet tall, or at least, that's how her memory had served them to be. Upon looking at them now, however, they appeared to be somehow taller than that, around 12 to 15 feet on average. Could this just be a trick of her mind? Despite feeling cold and numb, Annabelle's curiosity got the better of her. She made her way behind the shed and opened the gate leading off the property. Perhaps it was just the snow that caused them to appear taller than they actually were, but deep down, she knew this wasn't the case. Once she made it to the tree line, she was certain the trees definitely were taller.
How is this possible?
She asked herself, drinking in the scene.
I must be going crazy.
Now, had the young girl just left it at that, she might have just chalked the event up to her imagination. It had been a long and very bizarre day, after all. Instead, she decided to stick around a little longer so that she could examine her surroundings in greater detail, and she was quickly glad that she did. The next thing she noticed was that the fencing that surrounded the Summer family cabin was raised up at one corner higher than it had been before. The property, she knew well, was completely flat after all, though the newfound hill proved this was no longer the case. And that wasn't the last thing she found, either. A new oak tree had somehow formed somewhere outside the property line, one that was very distinctive in shape and size. There was no way she could have missed it over the years. Another pine tree, one that she was certain her grandfather had chopped down several summers back, was somehow standing again, tall and proud, its stump no longer there. Additionally, she couldn't be sure, but the ground itself beneath her feet felt jagged and uneven, as if smaller hills and indents were forming upon it. All this combined weirded Annabelle out to the point that she was starting to feel very uncomfortable. This familiar place that she had known as a second home suddenly didn't feel familiar anymore. Her heart was pounding in her chest as she drank this in, but she'd have hightailed it back to the cabin immediately if she knew just what she'd see next. Her eyes were scanning just outside the fencing when saw something that nearly made her heart stop entirely. Some kind of humanoid creature was standing there, just beyond the property line. She was feminine in appearance, and Annabelle might have chalked this creature up to just being a young girl had it not been for the fact that, upon her back, the creature had a large set of butterfly-like wings that were seemingly attached to her body. Upon realizing that she had been noticed, the creature turned in alarm and swiftly vanished into the cover of the pines. Annabelle remained in place for what felt like several long minutes thereafter, as if all the nerves in her body had just shut down.
What the hell was that?
Now, it's strange to think about how easy it can be to shatter someone's perception of reality. All it takes is just a single, unexplained event, and suddenly, even the most grounded of people can lose all sense of self and security. While Annabelle never considered herself to be the most sane and in tune with reality, this was one of those events that pushed her perception of it so far. She thought she might actually be crazy. The undeniable plume of blue smoke had already instilled a sense of detachment within the girl, as the sight of it had caused her to question several things. Yet this had only pushed that feeling of detachment further, to the point that she was starting to question whether she herself was even real. Apparently, the sight of the creature had caused Annabelle to tumble backwards, as the next thing she knew, she was picking herself up from the frigid embrace of snow. She had completely forgotten her original reason for going outside to begin with, and she made her way back toward the cabin with her mind racing with thoughts about what she had just witnessed. Just who and what exactly was that creature, Annabelle thought. And was she even real? Climbing the stairs back toward the cabin, Annabelle could think of nothing more than returning to the safety that the shelter of the home provided. Perhaps the home would re-anchor her back into the confines of reality, she thought, as the familiarity of its walls and furniture should serve as the perfect means for reorienting herself. Returning to the living room, she fell once again to the sofa, feeling frustrated. All she wanted was firewood. After all, a recollection she only realized upon seeing the fireplace, which now housed mere embers. She had gotten far more than she had bargained for.
Annabelle?
She then heard a comforting voice say. Her mother had finally returned, it seemed.
Mom,
She then started, looking at Hannah very seriously.
did you happen to notice anything strange when you went outside to get firewood earlier?
Hannah looked at her daughter, puzzled.
Not that I recall.
She then said.
Why do you ask?
Annabelle thought for several moments about her response. She considered telling her mom everything that she had witnessed, starting with the taller-than-should-be pines, explaining the unevenness in the ground, and even the trees that were there which shouldn't have been. Perhaps she could make sense of the creature she'd seen too, maybe. But something in the back of her mind told her not to. She had, after all, told her the entire story about the mist, too, and she didn't believe her. What would make this situation any different? It was equally as unexplainable, after all.
It must have been nothing.
She finally said after a pause.
I thought I saw something when going out to get firewood, but it must have just been a trick of the light.
Oh, I see.
Her mother replied.
Well, if it's firewood you need, I've already gathered some there.
She then pointed toward the fireplace, where sure enough, a small pile of wood sat, ready for use. Annabelle felt silly all of the sudden. Why had she not checked there first before going outside?
Is Grandma okay?
Annabelle then asked, remembering the thud they had witnessed earlier. Her mother simply smiled at this response.
Oh, she's fine.
She replied.
She just dropped a book she was writing in. It took a little while because we got into a little conversation about your dad again. Nothing too serious, thankfully.
Oh,
Annabelle replied, not wanting to think about the man.
well, I'm glad she's fine.
Annabelle, sis.
A hurried voice then proclaimed, coming from behind her all of the sudden.
There you are.
Annabelle looked up in alarm to find her sister standing behind her, a mystified expression in her eyes. It was as if she was suddenly relieved to see her and her mother there, as if she hadn't seen them in days. Annabelle felt a strange feeling come over her, as a sneaking suspicion told her that she wasn't the only one who had witnessed something strange within the last hour. Even their mother seemed wary of her, as if she too knew that something was up.
Isabelle, is everything all right?
Annabelle asked her.
I
I
think so.
She replied, though the expression on her face didn't change.
I was wondering if you could come to my room a minute. I'd like to talk to you about something.
Annabelle nodded in response, as she knew with full certainty that her sister wouldn't summon her to her bedroom unless the matter was urgent. Normally, Isabelle was the type who would forbid anyone from entering into her private space, unless they had a really good reason to. And that restriction extended to Annabelle especially. That day, however, it seemed the restriction was going to be tramped in favor of whatever news that Isabelle had to share. And Annabelle was not looking forward to what this conversation might entail. So, despite everything that she had already gone through on that roller coaster of a day, despite the fact that she wished desperately that she could just crawl under the blanket and cozy up by the fire with her mother, Annabelle stood to join her sister. She had several things she wished to tell her too, after all. But she didn't think that she'd have to tell her so soon. It had just been one event after another, after all, with absolutely no time to process anything. And Annabelle was tired. Yet, she entered the bedroom, holding on to the small hope that whatever news Isabelle would have would be good, or positive, or at least insightful. But of course, that wouldn't be the case. And Annabelle knew it well.
Have a seat.
Isabelle then instructed, her tone not hiding the fact that something was indeed bothering her.
Because I have a hell of a story for you. And if I were you, I'd get comfortable. We may be here a while.